All right, team, welcome. And tonight's meetings with Matt, as we really crack on with the education, is for us to just spend about 20 or 30 minutes digging into the meaning behind the bike sessions that we're prescribing. And I'm going to go through a particular emphasis that I think is critical to every phase of development in purple patch athletes and across all purple patch athletes. And it's what we call end of range training. So hopefully as we go through today, I can give you some insight into the thinking, the philosophy, and for you, how to execute the family of bike riding that we call end of range. So we'll go through, and I intend to primarily focus on the sessions around the build phase of training, but we're also going to talk about post-season, so what has led us to this build phase, and then how does that finally dovetail into race-specific training. And I want to be clear as we go through this, that this encompasses all levels of athletes, it also encompasses all ranges of athletes. And so we'll get into that a little bit today, and some of you guys might have questions at the end that focus to that. So when we talk about end of range, let me first explain what I mean by it. And quite literally, as you look at this diagram here, you see in the gray part of the program what we call real world riding. So what I mean by that is the range of cadences, your revolutions per minute, the number of times that your legs go around on the bike per minute, and that there is a typical lower end of range and upper end of range of what we tend to do outside when we're riding our bicycles. And the majority of athletes are going to spend the majority of their time sitting at somewhere around 75 to 80, 85 RPM. It doesn't really matter, but it's somewhere in that sort of sweet spot riding. And you can see that sort of darker gray cell or little piece of the diagram that I've highlighted. So that would be when you're riding along a flat road and you fall to your most efficient pedaling. And what is that? Some people are a little bit lower, 75, some people are a little bit higher, 85. But you're going to have your own sweet spot go-to pedaling and different characteristics. I'm a little bit on the lower end, I'm a bigger guy. If you're a little pipsqueak and you've got big heart and lungs but not big muscles, you're probably going to stray towards the higher end. The majority of Ironman, half Ironman, Olympic distance courses, many sort of triathlon courses tend to allow athletes to spend a long period of time, a high percentage of their time, right around their sweet spot pedaling. Then at the one end of the range and the lower end of the range tends to be about the range of pedaling that you might use on the vast majority of your normal bike rides outside. And so typically you don't spend very much time straying much above 90 or 95 revolutions per minute. Sometimes you go a little bit faster, but real world riding tends to be around 95 on the upper end of your cadence, maybe creeping up to 100. And on the lower end of range, you're probably not going to spend much time climbing up hills under about 60 to 65 RPM. And so 95 to 100% of your riding in real world range, what we'll call tonight, is going to be somewhere on the low end at 65 RPM and on the high end 95 RPM. Well, at Purple Patch, we do a lot of work at what we call the extreme end of ranges of those. And so on the low end, what we call strength endurance or SE work, that would be down under 65, 65, 60, 55, 50, even down to 40 or 45 revolutions per minute. And we're going to talk about what that is, but that's the low end of range. And that's synonymous, of course, with what I call strength endurance. At the other end, the top end, we do a lot of overspeed work, quite often in recovery, maybe in some preparation, but also some very specific neurological conditioning. So that's extreme high end of range, over 95 revolutions per minute. And that can be 100, 105, 110, 125, or 130 RPM for some athletes. And we call that neurological conditioning. So you have this framework. This is the way that we should sort of talk about this as we're going through. Real world range, 65 to about 95, but we train for a whole host of reasons at the extreme low end of range and some at the extreme high end of range. So what does that mean? Well, let's talk about neurological conditioning first. Why would we have you do overspeed work? There's a wonderful effect of doing overspeed work where it really helps with your pedaling efficiency. This extends to other sports as well. Increasing very, very fast pedaling where you can adapt and get used to, from a neurological standpoint, forcing overstimulus of signals coming from your brain to your legs, the things that are actually doing the pedaling. And if you can get highly efficient at riding at 105, 110, 120 revolutions per minute, that's just going to make you more comfortable when in the real world we are sitting at 90, 95 up to 100 RPM, when sometimes the courses or the situation demands it. Riding with a tailwind, riding down a hill in which you can generate power. And so one of the reasons that we do neurological conditioning or high end of range is for efficiency's sake. We also, by overstimulating, I talked about lighting up the brain, we also do very fast pedaling for an over-recruitment stimulus. So in your riding muscles, the sport-specific muscles, you have a certain number of fibers, and it's many more than my 10 little digits here, and I'm glad I've got 10. But let's just say this is a tiny cross-section of our muscle fibers. We want to, by overstimulating and going very, very fast, it's heightening the neurological conditioning, and therefore it's over-recruiting and over-firing more of those muscles. Of course, the net effect is elevated heart rate of that because you're using more muscles, but it's a good training stimulus. As related to that, when you are over-recruiting and you're doing things very fast, while it is training efficiency, it's not very efficient in itself. And so the typical response of this is that you're placing more of the stress on your heart and lungs. So your breathing is going to be higher, your heart rate will be higher relative to a normal power or the same power that you would ride at 75 or 80 RPM. And so we're overstimulating and getting some high cardiovascular stress. But what we are doing, unless you're doing it at very high power as well, is we're typically saving some of the muscular duress. So we're shifting the system to upstairs stress, not to downstairs muscular stress. And the final component of working on neurological conditioning is to improve pedal stroke mechanics. When you're going very fast, you get immediate feedback, either outside, as long as the hands are staying supple and you've got good posture, sitting heavy in the seat, you can feel little bounces in the pedal stroke. And by working on trying to smooth those out, you're creating smoother pedal transfer. Now, by going really fast, your brain doesn't have as much time per pedal stroke to talk to the muscles. And so you've got less awareness of what's going on with the ankling of the pedal stroke or where you're recruiting. But by effectively smoothing it out, you're going to have a smoother pedal stroke for all the ranges. So there is a pedal stroke improvement or a technical element as well. So there's lots of reasons to bring you up and out of the regular range of training that we'd use in the real world. But how about the lower end of range? Well, similar to above where we talked about over-recruitment, when you put a low RPM on any given power, you're going to make it more muscular. So I talked about low power, high cadence is high heart and lung stress. If we lower the cadence, you're going to have low cardiovascular stress, but it's going to make it muscular. So we get to over-recruit more muscles, and therefore it improves those muscle fibers into the usable mix. Either as the legs get tired, then we can draw on those because the connection is there to help recruit and generate the power of our race-specific training, or to actually use those as just to increase your sustainable power at any given level. So muscular recruitment as well. The second component is Pedal stroke, a technical element down here as well. If you're riding at 90 RPMs, as I talked about at 100 RPMs, even worse, your brain doesn't have that much time to create awareness or dialogue with your working muscles for the pedal stroke. Slow that down to half speed, you can start to feel your pedal stroke. You can start to be aware that as the front part of the pedal stroke is generating force, you can start to unweight that rear part of the pedal stroke and effectively link the feet together. That's why we always talk about, you'll have the cues of tension on the chain, looking to maintain no chain bounce and a really fluid pedal stroke. By lowering the pedal stroke, you have more time to talk to the muscles, you have more of an awareness of what a really fluid pedal stroke is. So there's a technical element as well. I think the most important component is resilience. So you're looking to improve muscular resilience. The vast majority of our sports that we do demand not just high force and high speed, but resilience, or what I call strength endurance, there it is, over the course of a long time, and facilitate you typically, for most of the triathletes out there, to run well off of the bike. And so we do this as a wonderful tool to help develop resilience over the course of your riding. And then the final component is really the way to think about this lower end of range training is strength training on the bike. So we know that we believe in strength and conditioning work, going to the gym or doing strength exercises at home, and that's really good. But it's most valuable if we can bridge it to our real world specific training that we're doing. In running, that's going up hills or walking on steep grades on the treadmill. In swimming, it might be swimming with a full any buoy, putting a parachute behind, swimming with paddles for some people, the ankle strap. But here, what it is doing strength training by hill repetitions at synthetically low cadences. And so it's important to understand this, because what we're really doing is training stimuli and not necessarily saying to you, hey, you're riding at 40 RPM because I want you to ride 40 RPM up a hill when you're in a race. That would be performance stupidity. And we're not asking you to ride at 120 RPM because that's where you should be becoming a spinning machine in a race. We're instead deliberately training at the end of range. And as we move towards our races, we're going to spend the vast majority of our training time instead in that real world training range. So in post-season, in preparedness, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, we'll start to prepare for the hard work. In the build phase, which happens for North American athletes in January, February, March, and so on, we're going to spend a lot of time at end of range, and then it creeps towards real world training and race specificity. So this is a really important tool of training that I think is, in many ways, for lack of a better phrase, the special sauce of our methodology. The key thing is that you as the athlete wants to realize that by training at both ends, what we're really doing is going on a journey of, yes, these training stimuli, but also we're helping you develop your toolbox of riding options in the real world. There's a myth in riding that your best triathlon or riding bike split or performance over a course will come by flattening the power, so riding the same power up and down any terrain, and keeping it at one cadence. It's performance madness. The body requires variance, and you are going to get from A to B as fast as you can by utilizing different ranges of cadences and powers within the real world range. And so this training really does bring out an awareness of the different tools you have. And as we get to the end of the presentation, you're also going to start to understand that you can actually bring out some of the tools in the toolbox when you're under duress to manage things like when you're riding in a tailwind, when you're riding in a driving headwind, when you're going uphill. And you don't have to just be reliant on fitness to navigate through terrain, which is really important. So this is the central part. This is the really important component that hopefully that helps provide us a grounding. What I want to do now is just give you a couple of examples of workouts where they sit in the different rhythms of the week. And then we'll do a little bit of application of this. Some of the things that you should be aware of when you're actually executing this training. So let's go to postseason. So that's once you've had your season break at the end of a season and you start doing the all too critical preparatory phase. Many of you guys have heard me many times say the anchor point of a successful season so often comes with a really effective postseason. And yet it should be the lowest stress of our global training load over the course of the year. But the reason that it's so critical is because it sets you up for the most successful hard work coming. And so the first workout at the top here is something that you've seen before, and the numbers are not that critical, but it's at a moderate effort. So that would be at a zone 3 effort for the most part. And it could be 4 or 5 or 6, but in this case, I use 5 by 7 minutes where we have an inverted pyramid of cadence. And you'll notice that what we're having you do in a session like this is start to introduce you to low end of range training. So that each 7 minutes of these intervals, I'd have you ride a minute at 65, then 60, then 55, then 50, getting pretty low, 55, 60, 65 RPM. But it's all at a moderate effort. So it's not overly stressful. You're not looking to drive up fitness or make it very challenging. But we're starting to prepare the muscles, ligaments, and tendons for the heavy work that you're just about to see is coming. Another type of thing that we might do at this time of the year is if you are going out on an endurance ride, say, hey, add a little bit of end of range training. So I want you to ride, and we just did this at camp with our pros, ride for 20 minutes, and then the next 40 minutes, you're going to go 5 minutes under 60 RPM, just smooth, endurance effort. This isn't trying to get harder or trying to get fitter, stronger, more powerful. It's just getting the muscles used towards that low end of range. The next 5 minutes, go over 90 RPM, smaller gear, lower power, higher cadence. Go back and forth, try and make it the same global perceived effort or stress over the course of the 30 minutes, and it shouldn't be overly hard. But again, preparatory in nature. So those types of workouts, and many of you guys listening have seen those, and it's not the only ones, they're just case studies or examples. These are the types of things that stimulate the readiness to then hit the nasty stuff. So when you hit the build phase of training, and that is the reason it's build is it creates the building blocks for your success in the race-specific training that's coming after this phase. And most athletes will have a couple of build phases in the year. The first one being the predominant. The second one maybe being after a mid-season break, we might put in a few weeks of build just to re-stimulate this because it's so important. And now this is where, remember I talked about preparatory, this is where the work gets hard. It gets really hard. So we are training less time at race specific and more time end of range. What we're doing this year is we have a couple of themes of weeks. And the first week is going to be a bit more strength focused. I don't mean strength in gymnasium, I mean real extreme end of range stuff. And the second is we're going to introduce a little bit of what we call SE pacing. So still strength endurance, but within that real world option. And we're going to recycle that throughout this year. It's a little bit of an evolution of previous years because I felt like too much end of range, too many weeks in a row was flattening the batteries and beating people up last year from pros to beginners. And so we're going to have a bit of a rhythm. This first example is taken out of the type of work that you'll find in a strength-based week. So what we would call just a pure SE week, strength endurance. So this is a pretty challenging workout. You've got 5 intervals of 4 minutes. They're all very strong. They're all zone 4, zone 4, 5. So right around people's functional threshold or your maximal steady state. Now it's important to realize it's global stress. In a couple of slides, I'll talk about how what zone 4 means when you're doing this type of work, but I'll give you a teaser. Your power at this low end of range is not going to be as high as if I just said go 5 by 5, 4 minutes, really hard, you're self-selected. You will see lower power, more of that coming. But what we're doing here, if you remember that slide we talked about, right at the end of range, we go 4 minutes at 55, 4 minutes at 50, 4 minutes at 45 RPM, 4 minutes at 55, and 4 minutes at 60. Hard and all way down at that low end of range. That is a very strong effort. When you're doing that work, it's really important that your upper body stays supple, hands draped on the bars, probably not in time trial bars for this, probably on a road bike or in your ball horns. You're nice and supple, and there's no movement. You want to be quiet as a church mouse upstairs. It's very good to start to train pelvic stability. And if you haven't done it before, or you do too much too soon, you're going to feel your low back on these because it's challenging pelvic stability. If you've had a great postseason, you won't feel your low back. So these are very strong efforts. Between the intervals though, we go very low power, zone 1, and we bring you up at 100 or 105 RPM. Mechanical, neurological conditioning, mechanical efficiency. So both end of range training. And there's no time during this session, when it's in the main part of the session, that you're riding at real world cadence. So this becomes a very strong dose of work. By the way, if you're wondering, that is a key session. That's really steady. The second session here you can see is where we actually stay end of range, but we want to come to maximal over recruitment. If you remember, I talked about over recruitment, 5 90-second pieces, either outside on a hill or inside on a trainer where it's ramping to your maximal effort, but doing it at low cadence. You might start at 70, then 60, then 50 RPMs, building to a maximal effort. Max is max, full steam, full gas, bottoms open. And then between each, you'd have complete recovery, three minutes rest or so, 10 minutes endurance. And then we go to a moderately strong effort, but we keep you down at that lower end of range to get the resilience coming off the back end. So this is a real strength focused, and you'll notice that the cadence here is under real world. So it's a strength-based week. If we go to an opposing week, how we might make it different and a little bit more real world is we might say, okay, now you're going to go longer intervals, 8 minutes, but you're going to have them in time trial position, because that's how most of you guys will be riding your bikes when you're outside. And it's going to be strength endurance still, but a strength endurance effort that is real world application. So not 45 to 50 RPM, but 65 RPM. And the effort that it's going to be is going to be about upper end of zone 3, maybe into zone 4. So it's strong, but it's not death-defyingly strong that you had the week before. It's a bit more real world specific. Now, if you're an Olympic distance or sprint athlete, you would be doing 70.3 effort. If you're an Ironman athlete, you would be doing a 70.3 effort in the build phase. If you're a 70.3 athlete, lucky you. The reason for that is where most athletes are doing their 70.3 or middle upper end of zone 3 is the way that I would think about it. That's the appropriate stimulus right now. Doing Olympic distance or very hard effort is too much for this type of workout, and doing an Ironman effort, zone 2 to lower zone 3, is not enough stimulus. So I wouldn't get overly attached to, oh no, I see 70.3 effort and I'm an Olympic distance. My coach thinks I'm an idiot or doesn't care about me. No, this is where we like to have the intensity in the range. Very similar to a session we'll do in a couple of weeks around running pace pyramids at this time of the year or at the build phase of the year. We would have most athletes operating around aspirational 70.3 effort, even if they're an Ironman or Olympic distance athlete. But this is the type of strength endurance pacing week. So what happens when you start to move towards your races? Do we just go, okay, now it's just real world cadence and we don't worry about any end of range? We still, not the case. We still have strength endurance as a piece of it, but we want to make it real world. And so what we'll do here, and I deliberately didn't put zones in, I will attach them verbally for you. This is a very typical race specific prep type workout, and we still touch on strength endurance or lower end of our cadence relative to what we will spend 90% of our time riding, but we do it within that real world range. So we'll do a lot of pace pyramids. 8 minutes at a strong effort, about the sweet spot pedaling. 6 minutes stronger at the lower end of sweet spot, maybe 70 to 75 RPM, sitting up well above race pace for most people. 4 minutes hard, and that's going to be at a strength component. So we keep the stimulus in there because we don't want to lose the training effect that we did all of those many weeks of strength endurance coming off of it. And then we come out of the pyramid. Then once we've gone through that, that's a big block of work, typically outside for most people. We'll do a certain amount of endurance riding to ride it out of our legs. And then you'll do 1 or 2 intervals at race specific effort. Now I put XX in here because this is where you get really specific relative to the distance of the event that you're training for. If it was an Ironman, it might be 2 by 40 minutes at Ironman effort. If it was a half Ironman, it might be 3 by 20 minutes at half Ironman. If it was Olympic distance, it might be 1 by 20 minute just at Olympic distance pace, or 3 by 8 minutes. It depends, but the key is you're hitting race specific intensity, and typically the way that I will prescribe that is executed by feel. So you come off the pyramid and then no data, no heart rate, ride and train the animal instinct. You've got the fatigue in the legs from the pace pyramid. Now go and ride and just have time and maybe distance on your watch or your clock. And then afterwards, if you are a metric junkie, you upload it and say, what came out there? And that's a better way to become more in tune with the terrain and go from there. So before we answer questions, a little bit of application for you. Some aspects to understand. The first, if you're riding at a moderate effort, an endurance type effort, there is going to be a heart rate response by sitting at that lower end of range. So imagine if your zone 4 was 250 watts and you were riding at 200 watts. At 200 watts at regular cadence, 75, 80, 85 RPM, let's imagine that you sit at 135 beats. If we bring your cadence down under 60, you will have a lower breathing and heart rate response. You will have a lower heart rate and breathing response. So if you're riding up a hill and you start to have a little bit of cardiovascular distress because you're riding a little bit stronger, one of the tools that you can use is not just go, oh no, I'm in my smallest gear and I'm spinning up this hill and my heart rate is high. Oh, I'm just going to slow down because that's my only option. Instead, you can actually, if you have been a good boy or girl and trained in this way and listen to the cadence, you can apply a couple of gears, slow down the cadence and lower breathing distress. That's a good thing. So at a sub-maximal effort, you have a wonderful tool. Not that every single time you hit a climb, you should be muscling your way up it, but you have a tool to vary the system stress. You can come up a little higher, make it a bit more cardiovascular and rest the legs for a little bit. And then you can make it a little lower and make it more muscular and allow yourself to resist some cardiovascular distress. So this becomes a tool, but the one thing to be aware is at any given power, sub-maximal or sub-threshold, at lower cadence, you get lower cardiovascular distress. A good thing to know and start to apply and think about when you ride outside. At a strong effort, zone 4 or above, threshold, you're going to have at lower cadence a similar heart rate, but there's a big difference. So what we want to do, I want to show you a representation of heart rate data. Imagine that you're going up a hill that's 10 minutes in duration and it's 5% or 6% in grade. So you've got 10 minutes and I say, I want you to ride up that hill very strong. If you rode up that hill at 75 RPM, your heart rate's going to go high and you're going to be under duress. If you ride at 60 RPM, you may actually generate a little less power, which we'll talk about, but you're going to have a different heart rate response. And what that will look at is a 10 to 15 revolutions per minute dropping. What will happen if you do it at 75 RPM is very quickly your heart rate's going to go up, straight up to whatever that effort is, 150 beats per minute. Boom. Within 30 or 40 seconds, it's going to get up and plateau. And over the course of 10 minutes, you're going to sit there very high. At the same power, if you do it at 60 RPM, it will finish over the last 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes up at that 150 RPM. So it's going to 150 beats per minute. It's going to stay high. But the heart rate response, because you're making it muscular, is going to lag. And you're going to have 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 minutes, even 6 minutes, where your heart rate is gradually climbing at a much lower level. It will peak out and it will hit there, but you're saving heartbeats. And so that's just a good awareness. And this is exactly what we did with 10 of our pros this weekend. We had them do both of these. We collected their heart rate data and the response was almost the same. And so this is a really interesting tool because when you're riding, when you hit a grade, rather than just going into your littlest gear and saying, boom, I have nothing to do because my heart rate's in my mouth. If you have trained it, you can bring cadence down, make it more muscular and lower the heart rate every time. As I talked about before a little bit, cadence is going to influence power. So for you guys out there that are absolutely obsessed with numbers, this messes with your mind. Because if I say go as hard as you can for 4 minutes, 5 by 4 minutes, that workout that I did, and your expected heart rate or your expected power is 250 watts, if I say go the same global effort, go hard, 5 by 4 minutes, and I have you down at 50 or 55 RPM, you simply will not be able to generate the same power. And that is okay. It might be 230, 235, 240, because it's just not mechanically efficient to sit at that low cadence at that hard effort. And so you just won't be able to get the stimulus up there and hit the same power. You're not a failure and it's not having a less stimulus. It's just sitting at lower cadence. And so I would really encourage you not to be metrics obsessed. I would be obsessed with execution here. And don't emotionally react. Wow, he had me ride 20 minutes and I averaged 220 watts. He had me do 5 by 4 minutes strong and I only hit 220 watts and I had 2 minutes rest between each of those. I don't get it. It's because it's really low cadence, synthetically low. Each of you guys are going to have your best terrain to generate your best power. So for someone like me, 200 pounds, that's at 3 or 4%. For someone who's 120 pounds, it might be 7 or 8%. And so some athletes are really good at generating high power at 60 RPM. But other athletes, they need to be at 70 to 75 to generate the same power. But guess what? The speed won't be different. So don't just be metrics obsessed as your only validation of success. And the final thing, as I talked about, the training stimulus is there, low end of range strength endurance, high end of range neurological conditioning, but then it's your job to think about it and apply it when you use it in the real world. This is the part actually when you hear us hark on about come to a camp, come to a camp, come to Hawaii, come to South Carolina, come to San Francisco, is because this is where really what we try and help athletes do. Join the dots between when they're sitting on their bike trainer at home or they're doing their intervals at home and saying, how do you apply that in the real world to make you a better bike rider? So this is where terrain management comes into play. And when we think about is areas like, okay, if you're riding up a course and you have a block headwind, is there a tool that you can use rather than just effort? And the answer is, of course, yes. You can lower the cadence, make it more muscular because you have a force against you. The same thing as when you're climbing a grade. You don't just spin at 75 RPM. You can vary the tools and come down to the lower end of range and make it muscular and manage heart rate. And the reverse is true as well. You're coming down at the Hawaii Ironman and it's a grade like this for about 19 miles, varying, yes. You're going to be going fast. And it's a grade that's shallow enough that for the majority of it, you can generate power on it. So you better be really good at holding pretty good power at pretty fast cadence. Otherwise, it will blow you to bits and create massive fatigue. So if you're used to riding at 110 or 120 RPM, as soon as you're riding your Ironman power at 95 RPM, no big deal, all good. And then, of course, it happens on many other courses with tailwinds. Tailwinds where you can sit comfortably, not trying to drive power up, driving mechanical efficiency at 90 to 95 RPM at a lower power than what you would be riding in regular conditions or into a headwind, but you're just sitting there with buttery pedaling, keeping your momentum going, enjoying a free ride without it having massive cardiovascular distress or neurological distress, because you're trained at 120 to 120. Hey, I can sit for half an hour at 95, no big deal. And so that is a once over likely on why we have such a focus on end of range training, extreme end of range training. Kerry, that was my quick and dirty. I think that was it. Do we have any questions?
Yeah, we have a couple, and actually I do think that you spoke to them through your presentation, but we do have a question about FTP testing and how often should you do it? What's your philosophy on functional threshold power tests to establish your training zones?
I think they're horrible things. We do have them, we do apply them. I think they should be periodic, but the truth is that I much prefer organically built, sneaking them in to athletes' training sessions rather than making a big song and dance about them. And so one of the things we're doing this year is we've got a couple of repeatable workouts that I'm asking all the coaches to apply, where they have effectively an FTP assessment built into them, but it's just not anchored around them. Are they good? Yeah, they're fine, but I think that people place way too much emphasis on, am I a better rider or not? And my only barometer is whether my FTP has gone up or not. We have many athletes that over a certain amount of time, they're just not going to generate more and more power at that parameter, but they can get more and more out of the power that they have. And in fact, for our pro athletes, while they might detrain over the course of each year, many of them are just never going to get more power. But the real secret is, how do you get more out of the power that you have? And there's a lot in what we talked about tonight. So yeah, FTP assessments every 8 to 12 weeks is fine, but we very rarely do it with our elite athletes. I occasionally do it with my one-to-one athletes. I think it's a interesting incremental little piece, but it's not the heartbeat of your progression.
Fantastic. And you did kind of speak to this topic when you were talking about variances in power, but Tristan asks, on the trainer, when doing overspeed work, is there a particular load or gearing that one should be using for this work? So they say they're on a smart trainer. So for those neurological conditioning efforts, they tend to lower their overall FTP, their overall power, to allow for a higher RPM at a lighter load. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, there are some workouts where sometimes we say we want it to ride fast cadence at high power, and that's just hard work. That's when we think about neurological conditioning in the tone that we talked about it today, Tristan. I think as low as it needs to be to enable you to get your cadence up. That's the way. So some athletes, and I should point out, it's a wonderful question to get, because we have to also realize on both ends of range, I'm going to come back to your load, but on both ends of range, I talked in the middle of the bell curve today. Some athletes are just not able to get as low as I talked about today. For some people, their range might be smaller. They might not be able to go much above 95 or 100, and they want to incrementally train to try and push that boundary. So on that, you bring the power down or the load down as much as possible, getting to the smallest gear as possible. On the other end of the spectrum, some athletes just can't get that low. Either their knees won't allow it, or they just can't slow it down that much, and they might really struggle below 65. So it might just be that the lowest cadence is 60. And if that's the case, do it. So do it where you can be successful. The pedal stroke is never like this. It's always controlled and smooth. And so for some of our really strong riders, they might be able to go 5 minutes at 40 RPM. But many athletes just can't do that without their knee pops exploding out and hitting the rider in front of them. So instead, it might be for them 60 RPM. But what you don't want is to take the easy path. Oh my God, I don't like seeing my power at 230. I much prefer it at 250. So I'm going to chase the power and F the 40 RPM and do it. If you can get down, do the work. That's the predominant piece of the equation. So Tristan, short answer, get the smallest gear needed to get as high as you can is the way to think about it, or the lowest power needed.
Any comments on cadence changes and how it relates to position changes?
If I can interpret that question, I would never ask, or I'd seldom ask an athlete to be at extreme end of range slow in the time trial position. So if you see zone 4, 40 RPM, I don't expect a rider to be in time trial position there. I expect you to be out of time trial position with great supple posture and form. But if you're at real world riding position, and it's a moderately strong to very strong effort, mostly you're going to be in time trial position there. I think that's the equation. Neurological conditioning, the more you can do it in time trial position, the better. Once you get up to 110, 120, 125, you're going to have to come out in all likelihood.
And how or why does using low RPM tools during a race help you run off the bike? It seems like that adding muscular effort might be counterintuitive to running well.
No, it is counterintuitive at the baseline of it, but the majority of, so the first thing you're doing is the race is to get from A to B as fast as you can. And that includes generating the best bike split that you can. And if you spin up every hill, keeping it at 75 to 80 RPM, you're either going to explode because your power is going to go too high, or you're just going to go really slow. And the bike ride consumes the highest percentage of any triathlon race. So we still want to get to A to B. As long as you are trained to generate it, if you just never train it and say, hey, go and vary the course and create muscular resilience going up some of the climbs, it's going to create a fatigue lag. But you're never sitting outside on the race at 40 or 50 RPM. It's just bringing it down 10 to 15 beats and creating less cardiovascular stress. You only have so many heartbeats in a race to use. So it's shifting loads between heart and muscles and making it more muscular. But interestingly, if you had to choose, if you had a single gear, you would choose a gear that would stray towards the lower end of range of cadence to help you run off the bike, rather than sitting at high end of range, smaller gear. That tends to actually negatively impact with the neurological distress of over recruitment of high spinning. That is not the best way to run off the bike typically. So if there was a rule, you have to choose one cadence to ride at, you wouldn't choose 95 to run well off the bike. You would much rather ride at 70 than 95, 99% of people. So if anything, it's going to help the variance and the shifting of loads is going to help you run off the bike.
Awesome. And good segues. Don asks, if during the pyramid, you're not able to get your heart rate down in those lower RPM minutes, but then you have to return to the higher end, what do you recommend?
On these pyramids, if you can't, so your heart rate is going to be high on these pyramids, the very strong ones. And if you cannot get your heart rate down, the main piece of this work, Don, is the 5x4 minutes. And so you do one of two things. You extend the rest a little bit, so you go to 4 minutes rest. But what you probably do is just bring the cadence down and say, you know what, I'm going to get the main focus is the low end of range. Secondary is high end of range. So quite often we'll just bring the cadence down at the easy recovery spinning, because we want the main stimulus to be that side of stuff.
Okay. And in the absence of maybe being able to come to a camp, would it help to learn more about how to link our bike power to our perceived exertion?
100%. 100%. If we think about the race specific, which is a really good time to do it, and even when we talk about every one of the sessions that we've gone through tonight, if we think about an index of three things: heart rate, power, perceived effort. So what it should feel like, that should be your driver. And I would start with that and then monitor your power and your heart rate, especially afterwards. What actually happened there? That was interesting. And like, wow, I'm a rider that if I'm at 75 RPM, my natural stimulus or where I'm sitting is 150 beats per minute. But if I'm at lower cadence, I'm at 145. That's really interesting. What happened there? Where did I have the stress? But where it really becomes interesting then is having blocks of work at the end of this session that I've highlighted here, 1 by X minutes at race pace. I absolutely love athletes to just ride or just run, where they're riding at a smooth and steady race effort without being obsessed of saying, well, my race effort is 200 watts, so I have to do that, otherwise I'm failing. No, what should it feel like in the middle of your race? Ride to that and see what comes out. And sometimes, if you do it consistently, you might surprise yourself.
And George asks, I've had trouble lowering my cadence to 45 RPMs and still maintaining a zone 4 plus. Any suggestions?
And George, can you type thing? Is it you can't get the power up there?
We'll wait on that.
Yeah, or is the power just going too high? I'm imagining that you just can't get the power up there.
Yeah, I'll wait for George to type that in. Oh, it says during the course. Oh, no, that's another question. Sorry. Is there another question just popped in?
So I'll answer the question as I think it is. You won't, if it's a zone 4 power you're looking after, you're not going to get the power up there, because at 45 RPM, if your zone 4, George, is 250 watts, I'm using that 250 as the number. It's 250. And I say go zone 4 at 45 RPM, you're not hitting 250. You won't, you'll hit 230, and that's what it is. And that's great. That's That's sort of, I mentioned that earlier in the presentation. You just will not be able to generate as much power when you're doing that cadence. Last week in Scottsdale at the Pro Camp, go and ride up that hill as hard as you can at 50 RPM. Oh, my power wasn't very high. Of course it wasn't. Now go and do it at 75. There you go, your power's higher. But it doesn't make it, it doesn't diminish the training stimulus.
Great. And during the course of training, when do you decide that it's time to increase your power or the resistance?
Well, if you're riding this workout 5 by 4 minutes at this effort, a hard effort at this type of cadence, you're like, that wasn't too bad. Then bump your power up because it's always, I much prefer across all athletes, yeah, let's see how it goes, bump it up a little bit. But remember, it's not just about, I think the key thing here is, it's not just about getting more and more and more. It's about training the stimulus. So if the overall load you've got in any, I'm sorry, I'm answering 5 ways. Let's take a step back. In any given week of training, you've probably got 2 days that are really hard. The rest of the days are either sort of endurance as a focus, recovery, or preparing for the 2 hard days. If you go a couple of weeks where those hard days are not that hard, they're moderate, but they're just becoming normal to you, then bump up the power a little bit. But realize over the course of the season, your power doesn't progress in a linear fashion. Typically, it goes from detraining to pretty quick ramp up as you get trained. Then it gradually increases, and then by the time it's race specific, you may have, for the less experienced, a slight grade over race specific. But for many people, it just plateaus. And in fact, for some people, it might even just start to drop off a little bit at the functional threshold level before your race-specific training. But that's because we're not stimulating too much. But for most people, up or flat a little bit. And so this is the general course. Then you recover, then you do it again. And over the course of the seasons, you keep coming up until you're just never going to get it higher. You've reached your physiological potential. Now you get more and more out of it. And many athletes, a great example for you fandoms out there, Jan Frodeno is not getting more and more powerful over the course of the last 3 or 4 years, but he is getting faster. And that's an important concept. And if it's the same for him, I reckon it's the same for you. In fact, you probably haven't reached your potential yet, but ultimately you will.
That's great. I don't have any open questions, so we'll just hang out for a second. And if I could just interject a testimonial for the San Francisco mini camp I was able to attend last year, and we put what you've just discussed in action, and I would have never believed you had I not put myself through it. And you had the campers, we did a hill repeat that was, I can't remember how long, maybe 7 or 8 minutes long. And the first round you said, spin as high a cadence as you can and just, push 95, 100, 110, just spin it out and see where you land. And then the next round you said, push the lowest RPMs that you can. And sure enough, we got a little farther on that second round. Then the third round, you said, vary your cadence, vary your RPMs, vary your power. And I got so much farther on that third effort. And I don't think I would have believed it had I not put myself through it. So I use it every day on the road.
Got to be in it to win it, Carrie. All right, gang, that's an hour of power right there. I hope that was helpful. We will record that, and thank you so much for being eager beavers. Super stuff. I hope it was helpful, guys. And the next one coming up is going to be running. Pace pyramids, running off the bike, and hill work. That's what we're going to do for our next meetings with Matt. Cheers, guys. Have a good one.